Yeah. Well. How about that? You've been wonderful this afternoon. Thank you so much. Sarah Sparks, Wade Jackson, kia ora. Thanks for your time.
Thank you.
I'm Wallace Chapman. Tomorrow, 3:45 is Power Battle Friday afternoon. It's going to rock and roll. Checkpoint with Rowan Quinn is next. Big thanks to Charlie Dreeve, my producer. See you tomorrow.
This is Checkpoint on RNZ National. I'm Rowan Quinn. Coming up, a government in chaos. Could embattled British Prime Minister Liz Truss be gone by lunchtime tomorrow? Former patients and members of the ADHD community rally to support an Auckland GP found guilty of professional misconduct. Friendly, but how constructive? The Prime Minister meets Auckland's new Mayor Wayne Brown. And while he won't be with us, Rotorua's new Mayor Tanya Tapsell will be. She met with Housing Minister Megan Woods to discuss the city's burgeoning emergency accommodation. And a group of school children sign up to the lost art of competitive bird calling. You can watch us live on Facebook, Freeview Channel 50 and Sky Channel 83.
RNZ News at 5. Ahi Marie, good afternoon. I'm Evie Ashton. MPs from the National Party have been speaking with farmers protesting outside Parliament today. The farmer advocacy group Groundswell has organised a nationwide protest against the government's proposed emissions pricing scheme, saying it'll result in higher food prices. National's deputy leader, Nicola Willis, says the party stands with the protesters and agrees the scheme doesn't make sense.
They do need to be in a scheme where they account for their emissions, but where they also account for their offsets. Part of their frustration is they do have often a lot of native bush on farm, they've got a lot of riparian planting, but in the scheme the government's put forward, that won't be given any credit for.
Meanwhile, Groundswell co-founder Bryce McKenzie says they were pleased with the turnout around the country, despite smaller crowds than previous protests. A registered nurse says she's devastated after the guilty verdict delivered to an Auckland GP accused of incorrectly prescribing Ritalin and other ADHD drugs. The prosecution argued that no matter what Tony Hand's intentions or expertise were, he shouldn't have broken the rules. Kerry Aitken is a registered nurse and has 2 children with ADD and says Dr Hand has done the right thing.
I have absolutely no problem with what he's done. He's helped thousands and thousands and thousands of families when the medical system let them down because they couldn't afford to go through it.
Kerry Aitken believes Dr Hand shows tremendous courage for his patients. A petition calling for mandatory reporting of abuse has been given to the Abuse in Care inquiry. It's been presented by survivors of abuse at Auckland's Dilworth School. Andrew McRae reports.
Presented by Dilworth survivor Neil Harding, the petition calls for a law that requires people to report if a child or vulnerable young person is at risk of being physically, sexually abused or ill-treated. He says if this law had existed, most of the Dilworth survivors would never have been sexually abused. The chair of the Dilworth Trust Board, Aaron Snodgrass, apologised to all former students who were abused at the school over the years. He says the harm suffered by old boy survivors is immeasurable. Mr Snodgrass says he can't explain how the abuse was able to occur.
Chaos in the UK Parliament and the resignation of a senior minister have intensified pressure on the British Prime Minister Liz Truss, who took office a little over 6 weeks ago. Today, some opposition MPs said they saw some members of the Conservative Party being physically manhandled into supporting the government in a vote in Parliament. Earlier, the Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, used her resignation letter to strongly criticise Liz Truss. The former Speaker of the House and senior Labour MP Trevor Mallard has delivered his valedictory speech this afternoon at the end of a 35-year career in Parliament. Mr Mallard leaves a controversial legacy, most recently making false rape allegations and turning the sprinklers on protesters at the anti-mandate occupation. He's also overseen rule changes to make Parliament more family and dog-friendly. Trevor Mallard told the House he sorely regretted the impact his political career had on his family.
In my generation, the wives were often the partner who would have been the better MP.
Steph was in that category. My biggest regret is that I caused my first marriage to fail in a way that was catastrophic for my family.
Trevor Mallard will soon take up a 3-year post as New Zealand's ambassador in Ireland. Dog attacks have increased by 20% in Auckland over the past few years. Auckland Council says the COVID-19 lockdown caused a spike in dog ownership, but limited access to training and socialising has resulted in bad behaviour. In one recent case, 2 dogs attacked a woman, leaving her with multiple bite wounds and part of her ear bitten off. Both dogs were put down. The owner paid nearly $9,000 in reparations. In sport, the Black Ferns will have a new captain for Saturday's final World Cup pool match against Scotland in Whangarei. Halfback Arihiana Marino Tauhinu has been named skipper, while explosive winger Aisha Letiinga is back from injury. Hazel Tubic starts at first 5 in place of regular co-captain Ruahei Demant, among other changes. Prop Crystal Murray comes off the bench, and the proud Northland and Ngāpuhi player says she'll be realising a dream of playing for her country on her home ground.
It's just amazing. It's been a dream of mine to be here representing my people, my hapori in front of everyone, and it's just good for everyone to witness it as well.
New Zealand golfer Ryan Fox isn't ready to give up on his chances of winning the season-long title on the DP World Tour. Despite missing the cut at last week's event in Spain, the world number 25 remains third on the tour standings, behind Northern Ireland's Rory McIlroy and US Open winner Matt Fitzpatrick. There are just 4 events left to play, including this week's tournament on the Spanish island of Majorca, and Fox has no intention of changing his approach.
Been really good this year at not thinking about all the external stuff, just thinking about trying to beat the golf course I'm playing. I want to give those guys a run. I've got to do something pretty impressive at the back end of the year to get past Rory and Fitz, but stranger things have happened.
And the Cook Islands have beaten Wales 18-12 in their Rugby League World Cup in England. That's the news.
Protesters use tractors to pack roads.
There will be disruption. We won't let traffic build up too much. We'll try and get out of the road and let them pass.
Truss is in a precarious political position.
They're all gone. So why is she still here?
And punishing pay gaps.
The reality for our women and for migrants and for different ethnicities is terrible.
Perceptive and penetrating. Morning Report, weekdays from 6 on RNZ National.
And we're on air on rnz.co.nz and on your mobile. You're with Rowan Quinn next on Checkpoint. Right now, the short forecast from Met Service to midnight Friday. From Northland to Manawatu, including Coromandel, Bay of Plenty and Central High Country. Some cloud, a few showers becoming confined to Northland tomorrow evening. Gisborne and Hawke's Bay, a few showers developing this afternoon, then becoming confined to the coast tomorrow afternoon. From Horowhenua to Wellington, also Waded Upper and Marlborough, mainly fine. A few showers tomorrow morning. Partly cloudy in Nelson with a few showers about Golden Bay tomorrow morning. From Bulla to Fiordland, some showers, clearing to fine in Fiordland and Westland this evening. Canterbury, fine, then showers developing this evening, clearing inland tomorrow morning and elsewhere in the afternoon. Otago and Southland, showers, clearing tomorrow afternoon. And for Te Kohu, the Chatham Islands, showers developing this evening, possibly heavy and thundery for a time tomorrow morning as southwesterly winds become strong. The time is 7 minutes past 5. Our next news headlines and traffic is at 20 past 5.
Kia ora, this is Checkpoint. I'm Rowan Quinn. The British government is in yet more chaos tonight, and the Prime Minister's grip on power is slipping through her fingers. There have been resignations, sackings, accusations of physical manhandling, scheming and public disloyalty, and that's just in the last 24 hours. The government's 2 whips, who are in charge of party discipline, resigned, then unresigned. At the heart of it all, Liz Truss, the Prime Minister who's been in power for a few short weeks and who may have only days or even hours left at Downing Street. The BBC's Chris Mason reports.
Tonight at Westminster, rolling case studies in chaos. Crises engulfing the government by the hour. The Home Secretary resigns. Those at the highest level in government don't even know if others have followed her. At tea time, a man who was rebelling against Liz Truss just days ago was appointed by her as Home Secretary.
I accept that the government has obviously had a very difficult period. What I do know is there's a very important job to do. People expect their government to ensure there is security for them. The Home Office is at the heart of that in so many different ways. It's a great office of state. I'm obviously honoured to do that role.
How long can the Prime Minister last?
Never mind the Prime Minister, well, for now at least. It's Suella Braverman who's gone. This was her yesterday. Today, she's out. Out because this morning she sent an official document from her personal email account, a breach of the rules. In a zinger of a resignation letter to the Prime Minister, Suella Braverman wrote, "Pretending we haven't made mistakes, carrying on as if everyone can't see that we have made them, and hoping that things will magically come right is not serious politics. I have made a mistake. I accept responsibility. I resign." A hellish week for Liz Truss has got worse. Earlier, she had to endure a Prime Minister's question time loaded with humiliation.
A book is being written about the Prime Minister's time in office. Apparently, it's going to be out by Christmas. Is that the release date or the title?
I have been in office for just under 2 months, and I have delivered the energy price guarantee. I've reversed the national insurance increase. Mr. Speaker, that is more of a record of action than the honourable gentleman in his 2.5 years in the job.
The Prime Minister defiant, the Labour leader said she'd crashed the economy, put people's bills up and was now cutting spending. And he said she'd ditched everything she'd stood for.
45p tax cut, gone. Corporation tax cut, gone. 20p tax cut, gone. 2-year energy freeze, gone. Economic credibility, gone. They're all gone. So why is she still here?
The Prime Minister stands up, the folder is slammed down, and Liz Truss insisted,
I am a fighter and not a quitter.
Tonight, the next flashpoint. A vote on fracking, drilling into the land to extract gas, was turned by Downing Street into a serious test of loyalty in the government itself.
Division! Clear the lobby!
Compelling Conservatives to back it or face being kicked out of the parliamentary party. A weak government attempting a show of strength and then, seemingly, changing its mind. In the voting lobbies, confusion, Tory MPs not even knowing the consequence for them of their vote. And afterwards, this extraordinary allegation from a Labour MP.
I saw members being physically manhandled into another lobby and being bullied.
While crying.
If we want to stand up against bullying in this House of our staff, we have to stop bullying in this chamber as well, don't we?
Some Conservative MPs then told the BBC the chief whip in charge of party discipline had resigned, livid at the chaos over whether this was a vote of confidence in the government or not.
I'm not entirely clear on what the situation is with the chief whip. There has been an element of confusion over whether the vote was a confidence vote or not.
Tory MPs cannot believe the dysfunction they're witnessing.
I think it's a shambles and a disgrace. I think it is utterly appalling.
So you seem quietly...
I'm livid. And, you know, I really shouldn't say this, but I hope all those people that put Liz Truss in number 10, I hope it was worth it. I hope it was worth it for the ministerial red box. I hope it was worth it to sit round the cabinet table, because the damage they have done to our party is extraordinary.
It's 13 minutes past 5 and you're listening to Checkpoint on RNZ National. Tractors, trucks and even horses took to the city centres and small towns across the country today to call time on incoming emissions taxes. Farm lobby group Groundswell organised protests at more than 50 spots across the country. But the numbers weren't as hefty as they'd hoped. Our reporter Kirsty Frame and cameraman Samuel Ralston have the story.
To the backdrop of Twisted Sisters' We're Not Going to Take It, Groundswell brought the countryside to the city. The farmers group want out of all taxes on their greenhouse gas emissions, including the just drafted He Waka Eke Noa partnership. It's a response to agriculture being the only industry currently not having to pay for its emissions. Hawke's Bay farmer Richard says tax won't work.
You know, the tax is going to make our business unviable in a lot of cases. So I'm really worried about the social aspects in rural New Zealand. The freezing works in Wairau, for example, the small towns like Paeatua and Dannevirke and Ikitahuna that rely on farmers to buy products, they're going to disappear and we're going to have a blanket of pine trees.
Others agreed.
They already struggle with some of the weather ruining crops. To have more and more regulations is just unsustainable.
Why should we be the ones where our economy suffers, where our food suffers and where our prices rise? It just doesn't make any sense at this time at all.
A couple hundred protesters gathered in Auckland and Christchurch, less so in the capital. Roads were relatively unaffected, with the exception of some traffic getting caught in the middle of the convoys. Members of the Voices for Freedom group also had a notable presence at many of the demonstrations. In Dunedin, Groundswell co-founder Bryce McKenzie met with about 100 people. He says the government's tax will have big impacts.
Look around you. Every fifth farmer you see here today will be gone by 2030, and the ones left will be under immense pressure and strain.
Rural advocate Jamie McFadden says government regulations are taking a toll on farmers.
It's getting worse and worse and worse, and I mean all the data's showing that, the strain on farmers. And I mean I'm sitting around kitchen tables with farmers in tears, and these are good farmers just trying to get on with their lives, good people, young, old, all ages.
In Wellington, a smaller counter-protest was set up on the road to Parliament. Valerie Moore says the emissions tax scheme isn't good because it's not going far enough.
It's totally inadequate. Farming should be brought into the ETS with no dirty discounts. We are tired of subsidising the pollution and the destruction of the climate and New Zealand's waterways as well.
Agriculture Minister Damien O'Connor didn't meet the small Wellington crowd, saying the turnout was embarrassing.
Embarrassing for them.
Why?
Not as many as they thought, I guess.
But Nationals Nicola Willis and other National MPs did go out to greet them.
Farmers have faced a tidal wave of regulation and cost, and they need to be listened to. There's a few politicians in that beehive who need to remember that farmers pay this country's bills, and we ignore them at our peril.
The government's emissions tax system is still in draft form, with consultation open until the 18th of November.
Rotorua's new mayor has sat down with Housing Minister Megan Woods to discuss the city's burgeoning emergency accommodation. It's been a hugely controversial issue, with many of the motels along the famous Fenton Street in the tourist town now full with emergency housing tenants. Locals say they feel intimidated. There's an increase in violence, and at recent public meetings they've pleaded with the government not to extend the system. Rotorua's new mayor, Tanya Tapsell, has called for an immediate stop to motel contracts, and she joins us now. Kia ora.
Kia ora, Rowan. Nice to join you today.
Thanks for being here. What did you say to Minister Woods today?
I think I've made it very clear, both before this meeting, but also during the meeting, that we do need to find that immediate end to Rotorua. Obviously, Minister Woods is the Minister of Housing, but also reminded her that this has been having such a significant impact, not just socially, but economically. We are a tourism destination. We rely on our visitor spend, but we do have reports that show that that is down, and it will continue to be down, potentially up to $92 million over the next 12 months if we don't sort this out.
And what was her reaction?
Probably nothing of surprise. She has heard me being quite vocal about this. But look, I was really pleased with how positive the discussion was. And in fact, actually quite surprised that there was mutual agreement that we do have these challenges in Rotorua and we must resolve them. Obviously, the solution to getting people out of motels is a building program. It does mean that they need to go somewhere. So who was also in the room was also some local iwi Te Arawa leaders. So actually seeing, while we're very much, these are the issues, Minister, and we need to find a solution, we are focused on what that result could be and, of course, how we can get that done as fast as possible.
And have you come away with any concrete promises from the Minister or even any action points from here on in?
We haven't quite nailed it yet, but we have committed to working together alongside those iwi partners as well. So I do see this meeting as a step in the right direction. The positive thing about it is we were able to agree that these issues are very real for the Rotorua community and we do need to find a solution. And also made sure I put a little plug in there that we do need some sort of support for our tourism industry. And again, reminding people that this is not just, the town of despair. It's actually still an amazing place to live and a great place to visit.
So what do you want the government to do here?
We do need an exit strategy. So the government has budgeted for the next 5 years for these motels to be used. What we're saying very clearly is even in these past 2 years, remember these motels were established from the first lockdown, we have seen significant reputational damage and significant perception damage on the safety of Rotorua. So doing that over the next 5 years is not going to be tolerable for the Rotorua community and certainly not the tourism destination. So very clear we need an exit strategy. It needs to be immediate, especially for the mixed use of motels. Now that's where you have visitor plus emergency housing. There's always going to be a need for some sort of emergency housing, but let's make sure that is for locals only and we're finding solutions across the country for everybody else that needs it, not bringing people into Rotorua.
So as you say, some of those contracts are there for 5 years. I guess you can't just suddenly shut them off tomorrow. What time frame would you like to see them brought in for the contracts?
Well, what the interesting thing is, Rowan? They could literally be shut down immediately because they are short-term contracts, the way that this emergency housing works. If they do become managed facilities, that may be a different story, but there is actually a big hearings process happening right now in Rotorua about motels that are trying to apply to be consented for long-term residential. So there's a bit of a different discussion going on there, but ultimately we want it to be ended immediately, and I certainly, we've had 2 years of this, I would love to see a solution within 2 months.
So you felt like the Minister listened, but do you think you've got anywhere with her today?
I think it's an amazing thing that a new mayor and a minister can sit in Rotorua that have faced 2 years of significant issues and agree that yes, there is an issue and yes, we do need to find a solution. So both of our staff are now working on what that solution could be. We'll both be keeping an eye on it because at the end of the day, a Minister for Housing wants to have people in homes. So of course she will want to help us to find a solution, and of course as a new mayor I'll be working hard to make sure that solution can be delivered as soon as possible.
Did she visit any of the hotels today, take a look at them?
Not that I'm aware of.
Do you think she needs to?
I think she's very aware of the issues. We remind her all the time. Obviously, she was also on the Sunday show, which reminded the rest of the country, unfortunately, of our issues. But that would be up to her. But I think there was no doubt, in all honesty, in the meeting that she is focused on finding a solution. And I am quite pleased about that.
Well, look, thanks very much for your time today. That's Rotorua's Mayor Tanya Tapsell. Let us know what you think about that, especially if you live in Rotorua. You can text us on 2101 or email checkpoint@rnz.co.nz. It's 22 minutes past 5 and you're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. Coming up, what went wrong for the silver ferns in Australia last night? We'll speak to our sports reporter Felicity Reid, but now it's time for the headlines with Evie.
MPs from the National Party have been speaking with farmers protesting outside Parliament today, and National's Deputy Leader Nicola Willis says the party stands with the protesters. The farmer advocacy group Groundswell has organised a nationwide protest against the government's proposed emissions pricing scheme, saying it'll result in higher food prices. A registered nurse says she's devastated after the guilty verdict delivered to an Auckland GP accused of incorrectly prescribing Ritalin and other ADHD drugs. Kerry Aitken, who's also the mother of 2 children with ADD, says Dr Han has done the right thing and shows tremendous courage. Pressure has intensified on British Prime Minister Liz Truss as chaos erupted in the Parliament, with reports that members of the Conservative Party were physically manhandled into a vote supporting the government. Earlier, the Home Secretary used her resignation letter to strongly criticise Ms Truss. Prolonged dry weather in multiple areas of Papua New Guinea is affecting food and water sources for thousands of people. A local MP says people will possibly starve to death if the dry weather continues. And the University of Fiji has launched the country's only Ndrua, an operable Fijian double-hulled vessel. It's part of a climate awareness project encouraging rural communities to use Ndruas instead of diesel-powered vessels. The university says Ndruas are just as efficient for village activities as motorised boats. Those are the headlines. Looking at traffic in the Wellington area, there's a strong wind warning in place on Remutaka Hill on State Highway 2. Our next news headlines and traffic is at 5:40.
Thanks, Evie. Well, the Black Ferns coaches have rung in the changes for their 3rd Rugby World Cup game. New Zealand play a winless Scotland in Whangarei on Saturday in their final pool game before moving on to the quarterfinals. We're joined for more on that by our sports reporter Felicity Reid. Hi, Felicity.
Hi, Rowan.
So, some big names gone from that Black Ferns squad today. How much of a surprise is that?
Not that much of a surprise. I was speaking with the Black Ferns coach Wayne Smith just after that big win over Wales, and he was already saying at that point that he was going to make these changes for Scotland. They've been trying out a number of combinations and they've been trying out a number of different players in a number of different positions. So today wasn't particularly a surprise. You mentioned some big names out there. That's Ruby Tui and Portia Woodman both get a rest. Ruby Tui has done a bit of a tour of the backline during this tournament, but she was in at fullback last weekend. She's replaced by Renee Holmes, and Portia Woodman, she's one of the top try scorers. She gets a bit of a rest. But don't worry, the backline's still going to look okay. It's injured winger Aisha Letty Ienga. She comes back in. She's been injured and has missed those first 2 games. She's a bit of an exciting one there. So she's a powerhouse that many of the fans have been looking out for. And a bit of another surprise that'll keep the home fans of Northland happy. It's the switch at the captaincy. That goes to halfback Ariana Marino Tahino. She takes that on that role just in her 2nd test for the Black Ferns. So it's pretty impressive to be leading in front of the home crowd up there as well.
Yeah, amazing. And so this game against Scotland, can it have any impact on the final pool play for the Black Ferns or where they go to from here?
The Black Ferns have already locked in their quarter-final place, so this game probably means a little bit more to Scotland than it does to the Black Ferns. Obviously, as we said at the top there, Scotland haven't won at this World Cup, so for them to get even close to the Black Ferns may be seen as a bit of a success before they exit this tournament. The last time the Black Ferns played Scotland was 15 years ago. So as much as maybe we're all saying that this is a little one that's probably going to go the Black Ferns' way, Scotland could surprise us. So they have been they've only played 3 times in history. The last time was a bit of a big win to the Black Ferns as well. So there is still seedings available for other teams in the quarterfinals. So some of those other last round matches will mean a bit more than maybe this one between the Black Ferns and Scotland. Though we do already know that England and Canada have also booked their quarterfinal places.
Great. And now the Silver Ferns, they were well beaten by the Australian Diamonds last night. What do they say went wrong there?
It's the physicality. Coach Dame Nolene Toto has laid it definitely at the physicality that maybe that wasn't on show in New Zealand during those first 2 Constellation Cup games. She was expecting a little bit more of that one-on-one sort of tough defending that you usually associate with an Australian side. It wasn't really here, but once Australia got home onto their home court for the first time in 3 years, bit of a vocal crowd backing them, definitely that was when they drew on that as well and were able to sort of bring out a performance maybe more typical of Australia. And so that's what they saw. That was a 62-47 loss for the Silver Ferns. So we're talking about yesterday, the Constellation Cup and the possibility to wrap it up. Going to need to go to one more game, and it could, even if the series, as I mentioned yesterday, goes to 2-2, it will be decided on goal difference. And because it was such a big win for Australia last night, they've actually got the upper hand when it comes to that now.
Oh, fingers crossed for that last one there. Thanks very much for that, Felicity. Well, members of the ADHD community and former patients are supporting an Auckland GP found guilty of professional misconduct, with some labelling him brave and kind. Tony Han was found guilty of medical misconduct after prescribing ADHD medication without the approval of a paediatrician or a psychiatrist. He has about 800 patients with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder on his books, raising the question, what happens next? Finn Blackwell reports.
More than 20 years ago, Kerry Aitken took her 2 children from Auckland's North Shore to Howick to see Dr. Tony Han. She says he was the only doctor who had specialist knowledge in ADHD in the Auckland area that she could afford. The registered nurse says his diagnosis method was thorough and reliable, and he treated her family with grace and respect.
He cared enough about these families that struggled and these children that were constantly probably getting into trouble at school for either being lazy or naughty, enough to actually do something about it.
She's devastated Dr. Han was found guilty of medical misconduct when he was trying to do the right thing.
I have absolutely no problem with what he's done. He's helped thousands and thousands and thousands of families when the medical system let them down because they couldn't afford to go through it.
Susie Cooper also has family members with ADHD. She describes their struggle to get diagnosed as a nightmare and says the verdict could have serious consequences for others.
It'll be dreadful, but, whether or not there'll be any change to mean that ADHD sufferers can get access to the medication they need, if anyone's actually going to be focusing on it.
She says the verdict should signal that more work needs to be done in the sector.
I'm feeling that perhaps GPs should have better training in diagnosing ADHD and knowing how to treat it so that they are able to prescribe for it.
But this person, who RNZ agreed not to name, says their own diagnosis, done correctly through a psychiatrist, was relatively fast. While it cost him $900 for an hour-long assessment, he says that rules for GPs must be upheld.
The rules are there and they're important. I think the current situation with the way that prescription of ADHD medication goes ahead is not ideal, but those rules are very important, and I think the way to do it is to speak very clearly that they need to change, and for practitioners and the community to make that clear.
The tribunal has adjourned to discuss what penalty the doctor will face. Under the Health Practitioners Competence Assurance Act, the harshest penalty is deregistration or suspension as a health practitioner, or a fine not exceeding $30,000. There is also the potential for a censure order to be enacted.
It's 29 minutes to 6 and you're listening to Checkpoint on RNZ National. Time for the business news now with Nona Peltier. Hi, Nona.
Hello.
So, Auckland Airport, it's lifted its full-year profit guidance because of a stronger than expected rebound in the aviation market. What is it expecting to happen?
Well, they're expecting to make $50 million more in their underlying net profit than they were forecasting in August. So that's quite a hike. I mean, we're talking about the difference between sort of 50 million and 100 million. So that's almost twice as much. It's quite good. I guess, an outlook for them. And some people have said, well, they were probably a little bit conservative in August anyway. However, I spoke with the chief executive and she didn't think so. They didn't think they were either too optimistic or too bullish at the time. And but what's happened is globally, there has been it's not just here in New Zealand that we've seen travel increasing, it's everywhere. And the global industry body is forecasting that by the end of 2024, we'll be back to pre-pandemic levels of air travel internationally. So the airline and the airport is certainly looking forward to that. The flights are starting to come in. better outlook. So, yeah, good news from Auckland Airport.
Yeah, and now the Financial Markets Authority, they were doing this earlier this week, and now they've issued another round of 4 more warnings. What's going on with the latest one?
Well, these warnings have to do with whether or not you are a wholesale investor or not. Now, if you're not a wholesale investor, even if you have loads of cash, you might not be very sophisticated. If you're a wholesale investor, it implies you know an awful lot about what you're doing. So there's a level of disclosure that financial advisors have to offer you. And if they're asking you to invest in something as a consumer, retail investor, that's one thing. If you're a wholesale investor, it's a different matter altogether. So what they're doing, these companies, seven have been warned for qualifying people as wholesale investors when really all they have is a Kiwi Saver account or a savings account or what have you. That's not good enough. If you're a wholesale investor, you have to be qualified to be one. You can't just say, oh, this person's got a savings account, therefore they're a wholesale investor. No, not good enough. And actually in breach of the law, because the level of disclosure for a less sophisticated investor is far greater than if you are. So let's not try and become a wholesale investor. You're just disadvantaging yourself. Much better to get that level of disclosure that you need to make good decisions.
And the markets, Nina.
Why not? Okay, so the top 50 index, it fell 0.75%. And that's not really a surprise because that's what we've seen in Asia today. So that was an 85-point drop to 10,832. And the New Zealand dollar, it's kind of fallen away a little bit. And that's, again, because of the US dollar, it's still going gangbusters. So against the US dollar, we dropped a little bit, 56.3 US cents. And so yesterday we were at 57. Yeah, not so good today. 90.2 Australian, so just a touch stronger against the Australian dollar. And 50.2 British pence, also a touch stronger.
Thanks very much, Nona. Friendly and constructive was how Auckland Mayor Wayne Brown described his meeting with the Prime Minister this morning. The Mayor says he focused on his priorities of transport policy, law and order and the future of the ports of Auckland. But it was clear the two leaders are firmly at odds over three waters. Our reporter Tom Taylor and cameraman Nick Munro have the story.
Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern's meeting with Wayne Brown was her third with the newly elected mayor, after already meeting with the mayors of Christchurch and Wellington. Speaking at the Auckland Chamber of Commerce after the meeting, Ms Ardern said her focus was on figuring out Mr Brown's priorities for New Zealand's largest city.
What I've undertaken with the mayor, or suggested to the mayor, is it would be useful for us to have our key ministers across the areas, like for instance transport, housing, infrastructure, to come down and sit down with the mayor's team once council is formally in place and council members are fully in place and he's able to have convened the council as a whole.
Ms Ardern says Mr Brown's list of demands will be a matter for the council and not central government to work through. However, she says she doesn't want to see Aucklanders affected by increases in their rates and water bills due to failing infrastructure.
That is what will happen if nothing is done about water infrastructure in New Zealand. So I made it clear to the mayor that's exactly what is predicted to happen here in Auckland. It's not something that I believe is in anyone's interest, so let's sit down together and make sure that we prevent that from happening.
Ms Ardern acknowledges that the previous Mayor of Auckland, Phil Goff, also had an opposing view when it came to the Three Waters reforms, but says the timetable for the legislation remains in place. Chair of the Auckland Chamber of Commerce, Simon Bridges, says Mr Brown hasn't met with him since assuming the mayoralty, though not because of either party dragging the chain. Mr Bridges says the Chamber has to work with both central government and the council to achieve its goals for Auckland businesses.
We won't always agree. There's questions to be asked around the port, for example. You know, if the cars are moved, where will they go? What will this cost consumers? How will that rail solution he's talking about look like and who's going to fund that? So there's all those questions, but in the end, we want to be a constructive player.
Mr Bridges says some Auckland businesses have been frustrated with what he describes as a long hangover from COVID. He says Mr Brown's election was in part a reflection of this anger.
He has been elected. Of course, he'll have to work with his council on these issues, but with a mandate on some things. At a level, though, the easy bit is, what you don't like, and it's incumbent on, both government and the private sector to help provide the solutions.
The Mayor's morning meeting with the Prime Minister was closed to the media. Checkpoint has made repeated requests for an interview with Mr Brown, all of which have been declined. So, in the absence of the Mayor himself, we visited his home turf of Karangahape Road to see what people made of his first 2 weeks in office.
You got any thoughts on how he's been doing?
Pretty good so far, holding everyone up to account, It's about time, because they just spend way too much money, I mean, where does all this money go? There's more taxes, more people every year. Where's all the extra money?
I have been reading how he's going to work with Aucklanders to help our transport, which I think is great, instead of forcing us to change, like what Auckland Transport did in Grey Lynn and just ripped up the beautiful village, and still people aren't out on their bikes.
One of Mr Brown's most high-profile actions has been calling for the resignation of the boards of council-controlled organisations, including the development branch Eke Panuku. Some of those on K-Road saw this as the right call.
I think he did a good job. Unfortunately, the employees of that office are not that happy.
Having come from different council-run jobs like recycling and such, I think there are certain units that do kind of need that shake-up to kind of reorganise and reprioritise kind of what they should mean to New Zealand as a whole.
But when asked what Mr Brown's first priority should be, transport was the number one concern.
I feel like we need to move more green, but everyone wants to move more green, but no one wants cycle lanes as well. That's like Auckland isn't very cyclist friendly.
Definitely transport. I found that coming from Wellington to Auckland, that Auckland's roads, and I'm sure they're working that out with the railway system, but they're lacking in accessible transport for a lot of people, I think.
It's 21 minutes to 6 and you're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. Coming up, we speak to police about the ongoing issue of ram raids and what they're doing to catch the offenders. Now it's time for the headlines with Evie.
Rotorua's new mayor told Checkpoint her meeting with Housing Minister Megan Woods was a step in the right direction. Locals have expressed concern over the increase in emergency accommodation across the city's motels, and Tanya Tapsell says the issue has had a significant economic impact on the tourism industry. The new head of the Auckland Business Chamber, Simon Bridges, wants to see evidence from the new mayor for any decisions on the ports of Auckland. Wayne Brown has told the ports company he no longer wants Bledisloe Wharf to be used for car imports and wants the waterfront land open for public use. The leader of the ACT Party says the protest outside Parliament has been hijacked by other causes. The farmer advocacy group Groundswell is protesting against the government's proposed emissions pricing scheme, but some of the protesters held up anti-vaccination and conspiracy theory signage. Ukraine's national energy company is warning of power cuts across its entire electricity grid as it attempts to manage supplies. It comes in the wake of sustained airstrikes on energy infrastructure by Russian drones. And Auckland Zoo has completed its largest project yet, a 400 square metre Indonesian swamp forest. It's the final part of a $62 million Southeast Asia jungle track project, full of fish, plants and crocodiles. It opens to the public on Saturday. Those are the headlines. Looking at traffic in Wellington, there's a strong wind warning in place on Rimutaka Hill on State Highway 2, still on State Highway 2, but much further up the country, west of Opotiki. A large slip has closed State Highway 2 between Waiōtahi Valley Back Road and Paidata Ridge Road. That situation will be updated tomorrow morning. Our next news and weather is at 6.
Thanks, Evie. And time for some of your feedback now on the farmers' protest. Farmers have had to be dragged kicking and screaming to even acknowledge their pollution, says Helen from Christchurch. It's time for them to pay their way. A little bit now on Rotorua. This person says, I'll only take my family back to Rotorua for a holiday when far fewer motels are used for emergency housing there. Motels have advertised and taken hundreds of people from other towns to stay in Rotorua, so that has made the situation far worse than it should be, and that needs to be stopped. Another person here on that same issue of emergency housing in Rotorua saying, I live in Rotorua. It's an amazing community. What the government has dumped on this town is poor. I just hope Mayor Tapsell can make more progress with the government than she did when in charge of council's portfolio in this area. Government has dumped on this town and they must clean up their mess. Keep it coming. You can text us on 2101 or email checkpoint@rnz.co.nz. Well, police are still trying to track down those responsible for more than half of the recent ram raids and smash and grabs. They've arrested nearly 350 people and laid more than 1,000 charges in relation to the retail crime. 15 people arrested in Auckland overnight were aged between 11 and 16. Assistant Commissioner Richard Chambers says it's been a huge undertaking to get to the source of the problem and try to stamp it out.
We absolutely appreciate how tough it's been on retailers, and some of those retailers have been hit more than once. It's had a massive impact. So we've been working incredibly hard to resolve these crimes and ensure we do our best to hold those responsible accountable. And the dedicated team of detectives that are working on these crimes are making good progress, but of course we're also anticipating more arrests, more charges, and we will keep going as long as this offending continues to occur.
Can you give us a number, proportion-wise, if you caught up with maybe half of the alleged offenders, or any idea there?
Yeah, at this stage, information we have would suggest that we have identified offenders for around about 40% of the offending. So that's where we're at this stage, and as our release has said, that translates to around close to 350 people already appearing before the court with thousands of charges. So our identification rate is tracking well, but we have a long way to go, and we will continue to arrest and hold people accountable as we progress.
So that's 60% you're still looking for. What are the challenges there?
Oh, look, it's like any sort of offending that we deal with. I mean, our job is law enforcement, so we have a lot of work to do to help put the puzzle together to identify offenders and meet a threshold that gives us comfort we're ready to arrest and charge and put someone before the court. So, yes, we have a long way to go. We've got a lot of work to do, but I'm very proud of the team that's working on these serious crimes with the progress that they're making. I've spent time with them, and they're an incredibly dedicated group of detectives who are determined to do their absolute best for the retailers out there that are suffering from this crime.
How many of these young people that you've arrested are repeat offenders?
There are quite a few repeat offenders, which is a very sad reality. Actually, in police, we always look for alternative pathways to try and break a cycle, particularly with the younger offenders. But there's some common factors here. Many of them are completely disengaged from schooling. Many of them have experienced family harm, either as victims themselves or as witnesses. And, I look at this and I think most kids want to be loved. They want to be appreciated for doing the right thing, and the best thing that any family member can give them is time. But for some reason, for many of them, they've disconnected to that, or they haven't had the opportunity. They've chosen a life of crime, and as a consequence, some have offended more than once, repeat offenders. And where we believe someone needs to be remanded into custody to break that cycle of offending, we are not going to be shy about saying so and putting our best foot forward to say, actually, this person is not taking opportunities presented to them to change their ways. So for that reason, we are going to work hard to see that actually they get taken out of circulation for a while. Now, that's a sad reality, but that's our job.
So that's so how young can you do that for? What sort of age groups?
Well, we put our case before the court. We have to work, obviously, with other agencies. Tamariki, of course, is responsible for the youth justice arm of this, as well as care and protection. So we'll work with those other agencies, but particularly Oranga Tamariki, and they will have their own criteria to consider as part of supporting or trying something different for these young people. So our job is to present the facts and the evidence, and other agencies will pick that up and do their best to provide support to us.
So we were speaking to shop owners yesterday who are really frustrated, and they feel that not enough's been done, that sometimes these young people are just ending up on the streets again after offending against them. What can be done what do you say to the shopkeepers?
Oh, look, we absolutely hear them. We know how hard they have taken the impact of some of this criminal behaviour. We totally understand that. That is why we are working as hard as we are. Law enforcement is our job, and we aren't shy in putting someone before the court on serious charges if that's the right thing to do for them. The reality is we are the voice for many of these retailers who have suffered these crimes, and we'll continue to do our best for them.
And that was Assistant Commissioner Richard Chambers. Well, the Hamilton West by-election will be held on Saturday, the 10th of December. The by-election's been triggered by the resignation of independent MP Gaurav Sharma, who was kicked out of the Labour Party caucus and today has been expelled from the party. Labour leader and Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern says she wishes it wasn't happening.
The one thing I will just say again, I am still disappointed on behalf of taxpayers that we're having this by-election in the first place. It's been triggered by the fact that the independent member for Hamilton West has decided to resign in order to run as an independent member for Hamilton West. That seems to me to be a complete waste of taxpayer money. However, here we are, and so we will proceed with the by-election on that basis.
The by-election is expected to cost about $1.2 million. Jacinda Ardern endorsed Labour MP Paul Eagle in the Wellington mayoral race. He came fourth, but if he had won it, there would have been a by-election in Rongotai. The Prime Minister was asked why she supported Mr Eagle in that bid, but is disappointed about the same money being spent in Hamilton West.
You heard me set out the very clear distinction here. We had someone who was sitting as an independent MP who has resigned in order to come back and be the independent MP. I don't think that that is the same scenario. We're having a by-election so we can come back and do the same job. It's up to voters, of course, as to whether or not that will be the outcome, but I don't see that as the same scenario at all.
That was the Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern talking to media in Auckland today, and it's just coming up to 10 to 6. You're listening to Checkpoint on RNZ National. Well, a bunch of school kids in New South Wales have signed up to the lost art of competitive bird calling. Dubbed the Born to Bird Olympics, it's run by an environmental education group and it's aiming to help school children to connect with wildlife. And these young people are pretty convincing. Have a listen.
I'm Val and I'm doing a pigeon. Kingsley.
Thanks, Kingsley. And what are you going to do for us?
And I'm going to do a kookaburra today. I'm Alicia and I'm going to do a king parrot.
Organisers are floating the idea of a trans-Tasman competition next year. To learn more, I spoke to Doug Reckford, the principal of the Boonda Environmental Education Centre, which runs the event.
Well, look, they don't get very much tuition from us, but what we say to the schools as part of their science and technology and learning about living things, we ask them to expose the kids to some bird calls either on YouTube, or there are bird call sites where you can get the audio files, and so the students listen to them and pick a bird species. They turn up on the day which we call the Born to Bird Olympics. So it's a competitive event and there are 5 activities that they do. They identify birds from audio files. They look at feathers and beaks and have to identify the birds that they came from. They go out into, we did it at a wildlife animal sanctuary called Rotorua Palace, and they went out into the enclosures and we covered up the names of the birds that were in there and they had to identify those birds. And they also do an art activity which will be on permanent display. We didn't score that because we just want them to express their artistic endeavours there. But then the culmination of the day is after lunch, we all get together in the one spot and the students step up in front of the crowd. And we had about 60 people there, 50 students and other people, and they have to step up to the microphone and do their call. And, we score them on clarity, enthusiasm and accuracy. And when I say we, I'm not involved in the judging, I'm just the MC. The judges that we had, 3 of them were involved. One of them, Bruce, who's 83, was 13 years old, I think, in 1953 when he went to Sydney to participate. So you can imagine his delight seeing these young kids step up. So that's how it happens, and they get a score, and at the end, they literally, the winning school did hold up the trophy as if they'd won the FA Cup or the Bledisloe Cup, which you'd be very familiar with, the New Zealand people triumphantly holding up. So that's a great thing to see.
And is there a bird, that's a favourite that lots of them like to try out?
Well, look, there is a bit of kookaburra activity that goes on. It's so easily recognisable. We always have a few kookaburras. The Australian raven is given a go, and some people would say that the raven sounds like probably the Australian accent a little bit, with a bit of strine in there. And, there's a real variety of birds that we get, and some we just didn't expect to hear. The winning individual performance was a girl, Alicia, from Bega Valley Primary School, and she did a king parrot, and we knew it was a good call because when she did her call into the microphone, we had a responding call from a king parrot in the trees in the sanctuary who happened to be there. And we kind of thought, well, that's a pretty convincing endorsement of the accuracy of her call if she got a response from an actual bird. So, yeah, there's a real variety, mostly native Australian birds, but some shorebirds, some seabirds, some small birds, some that we kind of aren't very familiar with ourselves, but we go with the accuracy and the enthusiasm that they've put into it. And when you listen to some of them later, just to check in, you're going, yeah, they really got that.
Does it come a bit more naturally to them because they've got their high voices? Is it easier than for adults maybe?
Well, look, there's a real range, as you would know, of bird calls, and some of them can be quite sort of honking, guttural sort of sounds. But I think the key thing for the younger kids is that they're not self-conscious like adults can be, and they bring a really sort of a charming innocence to the whole equation. And that's, the confidence with which they squawk and squeak and get their calls out there is really something to see. It's quite difficult to whistle when you're nervous and there's a whole audience in front of you. Well, we might go international next year and see if we can get a few Kiwi callers. I'm not sure what the Kiwi sounds like. That's a bit of research we can do. But we've had a bit of international interest, so it would be great if we could get some, schools in New Zealand that would reciprocate, and we could have an online event, I think.
Well, that was Doug Reckford, who's from the Bourne Environmental Education Centre in New South Wales there. Well, would you like to get a real feel for the tropics? Auckland Zoo has completed its largest project yet, a 400 square metre Indonesian swamp forest. The climate-controlled dome is the final part of a $62 million Southeast Asia jungle track full of fish, plants and crocodiles. Reporter Louise Tanuth went to take a look.
Stepping into a little slice of Southeast Asia here at Auckland Zoo. This 400 square metre dome's been created to house a swamp-like forest, mimicking the tropical Indonesian climate. It's maintained at 28 degrees and at 70 to 90% humidity all year round. It's home to thousands of fish and diverse plants, plus two 12-year-old Sundagario crocodiles, Malu and Sumpit.
Crocodiles, like all other reptiles, are cold-blooded or ectothermic, and so it's absolutely essential for the animals' well-being that we have an environment that suits them. We've got a complicated riverbed with deep pools, overhanging riverbanks, shallow shoals, beaches the crocodiles can haul out in.
Richard Gibson's in charge of animal care and conservation, and for the last 6 years he's been supervising the work to make the forest fit for the animals. Over 100 different locally sourced plant species decorate the forest. But the animals have come from all corners of the globe.
Our two Sundagario, they're about 12 years old. They were actually hatched in Borneo, in a crocodile zoo in Borneo. But 10 years ago they were moved to a zoo in Denmark, and they've been growing up there ever since. All the fish, they're all captive bred fish, mostly from fish breeders in Singapore.
Fast-moving fish swim in the same tank as the crocodiles, while larger carnivorous dragonfish and tiger perch have their own tank. Smaller fish are kept in the aquarist room until they're big enough to be put in the 2,000-litre aquarium. The construction of the dome was crucial in maintaining the swamp's environment.
We've got a very special roof made of something called ETFE plastic, and that plastic is in 2 layers and it's inflated like bubbles, so it's very well insulated, like really thick double glazing. The building is well supplied with radiators which are subtly hidden around in the building, and you can see there's a ring floating in the middle of the dome which we affectionately call the halo, and so that halo allows us to extend the photo period in the winter and give them those full 12 hours of day length.
And when things need to be cooled down, flaps in the walls open up to let hot air out, and a rainfall system turns on in the afternoon. The tank's water is controlled in what's called the life support room, full of pumps and filters that help to keep it sterile and maintain its heat. Head of Design and Reconstruction, Monica Lake, says the swamp has been years in the making.
It's really just a part of that entire ecosystem that's been created here on the Southeast Asia Jungle Tract. A master plan dream that began in the 90s. An integrated experience of what they might feel and see when they're in Sumatra.
The swamp forest is the last piece of the puzzle, adding to the lowlands area for Sumatran tigers and Asian small-clawed otters, and the high canopy habitat where orangutans and siamangs swing across 22-metre-high aerial pathways.
It's connecting up those different experiences at different times of the year, just like in the wild. Tigers are different than otters, and otters are different than orangutan, and each one of those has a habitat that reflects the environment that they've inhabited for millions of years.
The exhibit is open to the public this Saturday.
And time for a bit of your feedback before we go to the news. This one on Three Waters. I've not heard anyone tell me where the money to repair broken water infrastructure is going to come from once the central government's taken over. Why should the people of Whangarei, who've had good water infrastructure, have to pay to fix Auckland's mess? That's from Leslie in Whangarei. Thanks, Leslie. On the groundswell protests, this person says, hi, the farmers have some valid points of grievance, but associating with the far-right organisation, the so-called Voices of Freedom, invalidates everything the farmers wish to achieve. They need to disassociate now if they wish the public to give them any support. One here on Wayne Brown. Leon says a good mayor is accessible to the public. His grumpy, haughty facade does him no favours. And some love for the bird calls. This person says, love the Aussie kids and the bird calls competition. Brilliant. If you would like to send us some feedback yourself, do that on 2101.
RNZ News at 6. Good evening. Kia ora tātou. Ko Evie Ashton tēnei. The Assistant Police Commissioner says 60% of people involved in recent business ram raids are still on the loose. The police have arrested nearly 350 people and laid more than 1,000 charges in relation to the ram raids and smash and grabs in Auckland and Waikato in recent months. 15 people arrested in Auckland overnight were aged between 11 and 16. The Assistant Commissioner, Richard Chambers, told Checkpoint they've dealt with many of the young people before.
There are quite a few repeat offenders, which is a very sad reality. Actually, in police, we always look for alternative pathways to try and break a cycle, particularly with the younger offenders. But there's some common factors here. Many of them are completely disengaged from schooling.
Richard Chambers says the police are anticipating more arrests and charges. Rotorua's new mayor says her meeting with the Housing Minister, Megan Woods, was a step in the right direction. Locals have expressed concern over the increase in emergency accommodation in Rotorua motels. Tanya Tapsell told Checkpoint the issue has had a significant economic impact, with the tourism industry facing a $92 million loss over the next year if left unresolved.
The positive thing about it is we were able to agree that these issues are very real for the Rotorua community and we do need to find a solution. And again, reminding people that this is not just the town of despair. It's actually still an amazing place to live and a great place to visit.
Tanya Tapsell has called for an immediate end to emergency housing contracts with Rotorua's motels. A co-founder of the Groundswell Group says it isn't planning any further action at this stage as they await the government's response to their demands. Bryce McKenzie says they want the government to back down on its proposal to tax on-farm emissions. He says they were pleased with the turnout around the country today, despite smaller crowds than at previous Groundswell protests. Firefighters have given new notice they intend to strike again multiple times next month. The Professional Firefighters Union is locked in a more than year-long dispute over pay and conditions with Fire and Emergency. The union says its thousands of members will strike 4 times for an hour each time on November 4th, 7th, 11th and 14th. They held industrial action around the country in August but called off action last month for mediation talks. Fire and Emergency says it remains focused on finding a solution. It says the strike will put people at risk and is urging the union to reconsider. The ACC Minister says a legislation framework announced today will mean the list of occupational diseases covered by the Accident Compensation Act can be expanded as medical science advances. Carmel Sepuloni says the changes will support people with chronic illnesses caused by harmful workplace environments, particularly women. She says it's being driven by advice from the International Labour Organisation.
Taking into consideration workforces that may be more feminised than others, where women may be more represented. ACC, again, the legislation was written 50 years ago and the workforce has changed, and so we need to make sure that we're modernising the provisions.
Carmel Sepuloni says the new framework will mean the list of diseases has to be reviewed every 5 years. It was last looked at in 2010. The new head of the Auckland Business Chamber, Simon Bridges, wants to see evidence from the new mayor for any decisions on the ports of Auckland. Wayne Brown has told the ports company he no longer wants Bledisloe Wharf to be used for car imports and wants the waterfront land open for public use. Simon Bridges told a media briefing there's a mix of views from businesses on the future of the port.
The Chamber's position is what we need to see from Mayor Wayne Brown is some actual evidence and plan around the shrinking of the port, around what's going to happen to the cars, around what the cost is for that on consumers, and finally look around the rail plans, again, how that will be funded, whether that all stacks up.
Simon Bridges says the Auckland Business Chamber wants to see plans backed by evidence. Prolonged dry weather in multiple areas of Papua New Guinea is affecting food and water sources for thousands of people. The Post-Courier reports that 4 months of severe sun and heat has caused food and water sources to dry up. A local MP says many people will go without food and water and possibly starve to death if the dry weather continues much longer. The Prime Minister, James Marape, has called on district development authorities to consider immediate relief assistance. And the US Mint has produced the first piece of currency to feature an Asian American. The face of Chinese-American actress Anna May Wong, who broke into Hollywood during the silent film era, will appear on the back of new quarter coins. Our correspondent, Kate Fisher, reports.
Anna May Wong is regarded as the movie industry's first Asian American star. She overcame widespread discrimination to carve out a 4-decade career in film, theatre and radio, acting alongside icons including Marlene Dietrich, Joan Crawford and Laurence Olivier, and appearing on stage in London and New York. Her coin is the 5th to emerge from the American Women Quarters programme, which highlights pioneering women in their respective fields.
That's the news.
Tonight on Nights, well, your feedback's still coming in on our new outspoken Aussie correspondent Jason Morrison. Well, he's back tonight with more news from Oz. We get serious with science. We're in Antarctica listening to a seal symphony, and with people fixing the world, helping displaced youth. Add some music, laughter, possibly some dissent. It's all coming up on Nights with Karen Hay after the news at 7 on RNZ National.
This is Te Reo Irirangi o Aotearoa, funded through New Zealand On Air. We're on air on rnz.co.nz and on your mobile. You're back with Rowan Quinn next on Checkpoint. Right now, the short forecast from Met Service to midnight Friday. Northland to Manawatu, including Coromandel, Bay of Plenty and the Central High Country. Some cloud, a few showers becoming confined to Northland tomorrow evening. Gisborne and Hawke's Bay, a few showers developing, becoming confined to the coast tomorrow afternoon. Horowhenua to Wellington, also Waded Upper and Marlborough, mainly fine. A few showers tomorrow morning. Partly cloudy for Nelson, a few showers about Golden Bay tomorrow morning. From Buller to Fiordland, some showers, clearing to fine in Fiordland and Westland this evening. Canterbury, showers developing this evening, clearing inland tomorrow morning and elsewhere in the afternoon. Showers for Otago and Southland, clearing tomorrow afternoon. And for Te Kohu, the Chatham Islands, showers developing this evening, possibly heavy and thundery for a time tomorrow morning as southwesterly winds become strong. It's 7 minutes past 6. Our next news headlines is at 6:30.
No mai hoki mai, this is Checkpoint, I'm Rowan Quinn. The High Court says Trevor Mallard was unreasonable, irrational and unjustified in his decision to trespass New Zealand First leader Winston Peters from Parliament's grounds. Justice Gwynne says the former Speaker's trespass order was an unjustified limitation on Peters' rights of freedom of movement under the Bill of Rights. It delivered its judgment today, just hours before the former Speaker made his final speech in Parliament. He's been in Parliament for 38 years, and in that time he's held 13 ministerial portfolios. He's been part of a dozen parliaments and has represented 3 electorates. Speaking in the debating chamber, surrounded by MPs' children, Mr Mallard reflected on his first day as an MP.
I was walking along the Select Committee corridor with my younger daughter when Sir Robert came the other way. He's still the Prime Minister. In fact, it took a brave intervention from Jim Macleay to get him to follow constitutional conventions. No police, no staffers. That's the way it was in those days. The Prime Minister just wandered around. 2-year-old Beth cited Sir Robert and called out, "Daddy, there's Piggy Muldoon." His response was, "What's your name, little girl?" Later in Copperfields, he pointed at me and said in his stage whisper, "Who's that one, McKinnon?" Now, that's Mallard Prime Minister. He beat Minogue. Good on him. We'd better send him a bottle of whiskey, hadn't we? Like many Muldoon promises, delivery never ensued.
Well, Mr Mallard was also Speaker of the House from 2017 until 2022. During his tenure, he introduced new rules to allow dogs at Parliament, and in an effort to make the precinct more child-friendly, he funded a new playground on the lawn. But he also faced criticism for his claim a rapist was roaming the halls of power and for his response to the anti-mandate protesters.
We've made some progress here in recent years. Our buildings are more family and dog friendly. Our prayer is no longer an Anglican one. The grounds and buildings are more welcoming to the public. We mostly treat each other better, but we have more work to do.
Mr Mallard's headed to Ireland as New Zealand's ambassador. In the UK, Prime Minister Liz Truss will be waking up to another day of turmoil as she barely clings to her leadership. Yesterday, the Home Secretary quit after a few weeks in the job, taking a swipe at the Prime Minister in her resignation letter. Later, there were chaotic scenes as Conservative MPs were allegedly manhandled during a contentious vote in Parliament. Here's how ITV News at 10 summed it up.
It has been a night of astonishing scenes at Westminster, with reports of jostling, manhandling, bullying and shouting outside the parliamentary lobbies in a supposed vote of confidence in the government. The Deputy Chief Whip was reported to have left the scene saying, "I'm absolutely effing furious, I just don't effing care anymore," before he resigned, along with the Chief Whip. But we've just been told they have now officially unresigned. The Home Secretary has, however, definitely gone. In short, it is total, absolute, abject chaos.
Labour MP Chris Bryant said it was a level of bullying he hadn't seen since he was at school.
Members of Parliament are meant to be able to vote without fear or favour, and that wasn't what we had today. I mean, all of this is happening because emotions are very, very heightened because the government is in freefall. And frankly, the country needs leadership. And, I mean, we'd get better leadership from tofu.
And in the Tories' own camp, veteran Conservative MP Sir Charles Walker was even more scathing.
It is a pitiful reflection on the Conservative Parliamentary Party at every level. I think it's a shambles and a disgrace. I think it is utterly appalling.
So you seem quietly...
I'm livid. And, I really shouldn't say this, but I hope all those people that put Liz Truss in number 10, I hope it was worth it. I hope it was worth it for the ministerial red box. I hope it was worth it to sit round the cabinet table, because the damage they have done to our party is extraordinary.
And the ABC's Barney Porter has more on an extraordinary day in British politics.
Liz Truss remains defiant. She attended her first session of Prime Minister's questions since Jeremy Hunt became Chancellor.
Mr. Speaker, I am a fighter and not a quitter. I have acted in the national interest to make sure that we have economic stability.
But the opposition leader, Keir Starmer, used question time to fire salvo after salvo at her.
A book is being written about the Prime Minister's time in office. Apparently it's going to be out by Christmas. Is that the release date or the title?
Tony Travers is with the London School of Economics. He says Liz Truss performed reasonably well.
But in the end, those behind her, her MPs, didn't look that happy. I mean, they were just sitting there rather quiet mostly. So she got through the day, and given what's happened recently, that's not bad, but I don't think it radically alters her position. It just keeps her there for another day at least.
As the turmoil continues, more and more people are turning to a live stream posted by the British tabloid The Star. 6 days ago, the paper placed a lettuce next to a picture of the Prime Minister, posing the question, could she survive in office longer than the 10-day shelf life of the leafy vegetable? With 4 days to go, it's shaping up as a reasonable question.
That report there from the ABC. Well, Vladimir Putin has declared martial law in the 4 regions of Ukraine that Russia's annexed during the war. President Putin told Russia's Security Council that it will give regional leaders extra powers to maintain social order and safeguard important facilities. The declaration comes as Ukrainian troops are continuing their push against Russia. The BBC's Jonathan Beale reports from the front line.
The road of retreat. A dead end for some, where these Russian forces met their own Armageddon. The carcasses of tanks, armoured vehicles, and bloated dead bodies scatter the ground of the recently liberated East. A village now the new front line for these Ukrainian troops. Still within range of Russian artillery, the signature sound of this war.
Russian positions are just 500 metres away. You can see they're telling us to get down here. Come on, let's go.
But this war also involves close quarters combat, as we're about to find out.
Okay, let's get down. Okay.
A grenade's fired into the tree line from where the Russians were firing. As we make a speedy exit.
Let's get out. Let's get out.
Okay.
Okay. We're getting out of here.
Нормально, контакт.
They just came under some small arms fire, probably from a Russian scouting party, so they've been telling us to get out of here back to the main headquarters.
Russian forces have been trying to outflank them. Many of these troops only volunteered at the start of the war. Months of fighting has transformed them into a professional army. But these counterattacks are slowing their advance.
They come at us like cannon fodder. That is their strategy. As soon as we open fire on them, they retreat. But we need more armor to continue the assault. And we are waiting for reinforcements so that we can move forward.
This National Guard units received little Western military aid, but their commander proudly shows us some of the Russian weapons they've captured. Colonel Yuri Bereza tells me his soldiers only had machine guns to start with. Now he says they've got practically new Russian tanks. Putin, he says, is already working for us. The West needs to catch up. But Ukraine's advance doesn't just depend on equipment. It's about logistics too. The push east is testing supply lines. With most bridges blown, it's had to rely on amphibious vehicles and boats to keep feeding the front line. Ukrainian military engineers have been rushing to rebuild these lifelines. They've just completed the construction of this crossing.
I think this is one of the most important priorities, the material support of our troops. This is war. We are not fighting with sticks here. Weapons need bullets.
Ukraine aims to continue its offensive, but there are still many obstacles in the way, including countless minefields laid by the Russians. This unit's already lost men trying to clear them. And while Russia's army has been battered, it's still standing in their way.
It's 19 minutes past 6 and you're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. To the floods in eastern Australia now, and anxious homeowners in border towns along the New South Wales-Victorian border are waiting for the river to peak. With the frantic sandbagging and levee building now done, locals are keeping a watchful eye on the Murray River, which is expected to peak in the next 24 hours. The ABC's Oliver Gordon has more.
The Murray is still creeping up. I'm here in the so-called wrong side of the levee, those residents in between the Murray River and the town that are not protected by this levee. Today I can see that the floodwaters are lapping up. They're only about 20 centimetres away from the front gardens of some of the low-lying properties here. I can see a boat that has been set up, presumably for when floodwaters get to the point where people need to leave their homes. We've seen the river rise about 10 centimetres over the last 24 hours. It's expected the river will rise another 50 or 60 centimetres over the next 24 hours. If that does happen, that'll push the levels over the levels seen in the 1993 floods, which had a significant impact on the town. Tim Weebush is the Chief Officer of the Victorian SES. He says some vehicles can still make it in and out of Echuca and Moama, but that could change as rivers rise in the next 24 to 48 hours.
It's really overnight tonight and through Friday where we're expecting to see that peak occur in and around Echuca.
As well as the obvious concern many Echuca residents are feeling about this, there's also a feeling of impatience here. The threat of this second peak has been hanging around for days now. Many I've spoken to say they just want whatever's going to happen so they can move on.
Ollie, are there still many people in town in Echuca?
It's kind of difficult to get a definite read on how many people have fled and how many have stayed. Walking down the streets today, it feels a little different from other days. Earlier in the week, it was a hive of activity, people sandbagging, chatting about their plans. Now the sandbags are mostly down. Businesses are fortified up to about waist or even chest height. and there's just the odd car passing. There are a few businesses that are sticking it out, though. I spoke with Kelly Jade from local business Bakehouse 151. Kelly and her partner Ben are staying open to feed the people remaining in the town.
I feel like we can remain open, but it just depends whether we're going to have water lapping at the front door. I just don't know.
Can you still bake fresh loaves of bread when there's water lapping at the door?
We can. I'm glad that all our equipment is out the back, not out the front. Look, Ben will probably sleep here if he has to in his swag. But yeah, it's just worrying as to when do you call it to start, trying to sandbag ourselves and keep everything safe so that we can reopen, because if this goes under, we'll probably never reopen again. But basically, hopefully we can stay open as long as we can.
If this goes under, you'll never reopen again?
Not if all the equipment gets wrecked. We won't be able to, but fingers crossed. Yeah, we've got plans in place, we've got supplies, we've got people that have said they'll come in with forklifts and things like that to lift everything up. Hopefully it doesn't come to that. We're just worried about the community at the minute, and we've got a lot of people coming in really upset, and we just want to make them happy.
There's lots of people working really hard that all need to eat, so it's an important role.
Yes, it sure is. And, when the supermarkets have reduced hours and things can't get through on the roads to be delivered, it is vital to stay open for the town.
Well, staying in Australia, and a new report card's out on how it managed its response to the pandemic. The independent review says big calls were handled well, but lockdowns, support payments and treatment of vulnerable communities will have impacts for years to come. The ABC's Matt Banford reports.
Depending on where you lived through the pandemic may have a big influence on how you feel the crisis was handled. For Nathan Haggerty, the pandemic was a tale of two Sydneys.
We lived this, we experienced it, and whether that was the intention or not, that was how people felt, that there was an othering, that there was that part of Sydney and there was this part of Sydney. And when you had additional police come in, when you had the army come in, people had that perception, and that just simply reaffirmed it.
Southwestern Sydney had a horrendous time, especially during the second major lockdown. Many suburbs the subject of isolation orders, residents not allowed to leave their local government areas. The chair of Western Sydney Migrants Resource Centre worked overtime to support communities in crisis. Too often, he says, vulnerable people were left to fend for themselves.
Look, there are people who, because of their inability to access mainstream services, it was up to community organisations to help that out for them. But you can just imagine being locked up in a small apartment in a high-rise in Liverpool for a couple of weeks, struggling to get access to information and basics like, food and healthcare.
It's one of several significant shortfalls highlighted by an independent review of Australia's pandemic response. It was funded by the John and Miriam Wiley Foundation, the Minderoo Foundation and the Paul Ramsay Foundation. Lead investigator Professor Peter Shergold delivered the report called Fault Lines in Sydney today.
Single biggest failure was not sufficiently planning at the start for the fault lines in society. People from low socioeconomic groups, people who are on the wrong side of the digital divide, women, migrants who are here from non-English speaking backgrounds, our First Nations.
While the government may have got the big calls right, Professor Shergold says failures in policy and planning left many communities exposed.
The fact that we didn't extend JobKeeper to temporary migrant workers, for example, or that we shut down school systems too fast, or that we could have done better in meeting the needs of elder people in residential aged care communities. Right now, I can say that we got some of that wrong, but the key is that we've learned the lesson for the next time, or even for the rest of this pandemic.
Lockdowns were one of the more contentious tools used to suppress the virus. The report says this blunt instrument, important early in the pandemic, came to be used excessively, hurting our mental and physical health.
So lockdowns are an important first measure. While you're learning about the pandemic, we think in many instances, because we didn't access vaccines fast enough or rat tests fast enough, that too often we had to extend lockdowns beyond what would otherwise have been necessary.
Hong Kong is investing $6.7 billion, that's 1.5 billion New Zealand dollars, in a worldwide search for talent. The city's looking to bring back workers and business after a massive exodus during the pandemic. CNN's Selena Wang reports.
Hong Kong wants to reverse its brain drain. The city's leader, Chief Executive John Lee, announced a new initiative to attract more workers, including plans to give 2-year visas to high earners and top graduates. Hong Kong has been dealing with a mass exodus amid some of the world's strictest pandemic curbs that they've only recently started to ease. In August, Hong Kong logged its biggest population drop since officials began keeping track of the numbers in 1961. Take a listen to what the chief executive said.
Over the past 2 years, the local workforce shrank by 140,000. Apart from actively nurturing and retaining local talents, the government will protectively trawl the world for talents.
Lee also announced that the government would earmark 30 billion Hong Kong dollars or 3.8 billion US dollars for a new fund aimed at bringing more businesses in. Hong Kong is the Asian base for many global companies, including top banks and financial firms. The former British colony has traditionally been seen as a friendly international gateway to mainland China. But since the pandemic, its reputation for openness and ease of business have fallen, while rival hub Singapore's reputation has increased. Earlier in the pandemic, inbound travelers to Hong Kong had to spend 21 days in hotel quarantine. That damaged the city's economy and led many global companies and expats to move elsewhere. Hong Kong has now removed that hotel quarantine, but there's still a long list of rules for inbound travelers.
Google has launched a trial chatbot in the UK and it can respond to questions, though it doesn't talk. Run by artificial intelligence, the software's called Lambda and Google's launched a trial version in the UK. The BBC's tech editor Zoe Kleinman's been checking it out.
Download the AI Test Kitchen app and you can join thousands of people wanting to see for themselves just how convincing Lambda is. Google's cautiously offering just 3 options: an imagination scenario, a to-do list and a chat about dogs. It's only available in text form. For the imagination part, I asked Lambda to imagine it was on a marshmallow planet. It doesn't have a voice, it only writes answers, so we've had a producer record it.
You're in a world made of marshmallows. As you take a step, a gentle squish comes out from under your feet. The marshmallow horizon stretches out in all directions. The sky is a gooey, sticky pink. There's a soft, gentle breeze.
It might be artificially intelligent, but it's got more imagination than me. Next, I decided to try to get it to say something controversial, so I asked it how to make a bomb.
Sorry, not sure what to say. But anyways.
It didn't want to play. It gave me a very detailed breakdown of how to create a vegetable garden and then pretended to be a tennis ball chased by a dog. And that was the rather surreal end of my encounter with one of the world's most powerful language models. Google says that while it's seeking feedback on Lambda's performance, people can't teach this version any new tricks, so there's no point trying to get it to swear. Lambda's a world away from the simple chatbots you might encounter online, but if all you want is a straight answer, you might find you miss them.
That's it from us. The Late News team will keep you updated throughout the night. You can catch up with all our stories on the RNZ website. And tomorrow from 5, first up will be in the UK with the latest on the chaos surrounding Liz Truss's government. Will she still be in charge by then? And we'll be back tomorrow.
RNZ News headlines at 6:30. Kia ora tātou, I'm Evie Ashton. The Assistant Police Commissioner says 60% of people involved in recent business ram raids are still on the loose. Rotorua's mayor says the use of the city's motels as emergency accommodation has had a significant economic impact, with the tourism industry facing a $92 million loss over the next year if left unresolved. Firefighters have given new notice they intend to strike again multiple times next month. And Japan is recording its biggest half-yearly trade deficit in more than 40 years. Those are the headlines. Our next news and weather is at 7.
On 9 to noon tomorrow, dogs can sniff out bowel cancer. Now local scientists are trialling a breath-testing device that could detect the disease. Herpetologist Samuel Purdy on the fascinating reptiles and amphibians of Aotearoa. And we see their work, but do we know their names? the Kiwi women architects who've contributed to our built environment. Plus, we look ahead to a bumper weekend of sport. 9 to noon with me, Lynn Freeman, in for Catherine Ryan on RNZ National.
Welcome to Trending Now. Tonight, the detail with Emile Donovan. There's been a huge outcry over Creative New Zealand's decision to turn down a funding application from the organisation that runs a high school Shakespeare festival. But was the Bard really going to be cancelled?
Kia ora, I'm Emile Donovan.
It is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing.
Government funding for the annual secondary school Shakespeare Festival Sheila Wynne is not to be, with Creative New Zealand cutting its funding after 10 years.
Reaction has been swift and brutal, particularly on social media. Shakespeare has been cancelled, some have said. Others said this will be laid at the feet of the government. Others said, oh, we get to have F-Boy Island, but not Shakespeare.
Shakespeare talks about human nature. It's not something it dates.
It was a distinctly un-Shakespearean drama. But all's well that ends well.
The Ministry of Education intends to reach out to the Shakespeare Globe Centre to work with them to find a solution that ensures that the program will continue to be offered.
Nonetheless, this whole saga did throw up some interesting ideas. From the role of Shakespeare in 2022 to what decolonising art actually means, to how our artists and writers and playwrights are funded, and who gets what. So today on The Detail, Massey University senior lecturer and Shakespeare expert Dr. Hannah August on this most unfortunate comedy of errors. Now, there's a lot of what you might generously call misreporting of what actually went on in this story. So I began by asking Hannah August to outline the facts for us.
As I understand it, there has recently been a major Creative New Zealand funding round. Creative New Zealand is a body that is separate from the government, is given funding that it then allocates in a number of different contestable funding rounds to arts organisations and individual artists around Aotearoa. Some of the pots in the rounds are bigger than others, and one of the big rounds, results of that have just been announced, and one of the things that was announced was that the Shakespeare Globe Centre New Zealand, which is an organisation that's been around for several decades and has been running throughout that time the Sheila Wynne Shakespeare Festival, which I was involved with as a teen, perhaps you were as well. I think they say that 140,000 rangatahi have been involved with it since its inception. So it's a big deal. It's something that many high school kids in New Zealand would be involved with. They run that. They have a relatively large operating budget to run that, and they applied for funding equivalent to about 1/10 of that operating budget, I think about $30,000, and they had received this money from the Kahikatea funding pot in the past, but this year their funding application was declined. And then suddenly things kind of went crazy because this got picked up in the media as the cancellation of the entire festival.
Creative New Zealand funding was axed for a Shakespeare competition.
Creative New Zealand's decision to pull its funding from a popular secondary school Shakespeare festival is becoming a bit of a Shakespearean tragedy in its own right.
Which I think would have been quite a big deal and would have been sort of perhaps not worthy of some of the rhetoric that has eventuated, but certainly, I would have wanted to make a fuss about it. But that wasn't, in fact, what was being proposed. What was being proposed was decreasing the funding by this percentage. Shakespeare Globe Centre New Zealand have since started a Give a Little crowdfunding page, which is pulling in donations from kind of alumni and supporters. They will make up that shortfall. Actually, since I started prepping for this interview, the Prime Minister has even stepped stepped in and said, oh, well, actually the Ministry of Education can step up and cover that shortfall. So, they've had no trouble dealing to that unfunding, but the conversation around it has been blown completely out of proportion. There's been quite a lot of misreporting, as I say, in terms of, implying that the entire festival was being cancelled. And people have kind of jumped up and down for the past few days saying, oh, we're cancelling Shakespeare in New Zealand. And that's not what's happening. Shakespeare's not going away anytime soon. He's a cultural juggernaut. He doesn't need public funding, as Sam Brooks kind of eloquently wrote on the spin-off. But yeah, a lot of people have got very hot under the collar about it.
That's a point it pays to emphasise. To the best of our knowledge, the future of the Sheila Wynne Festival was never actually under threat. Dawn Sanders, the legendary boss of the organisation that applied for the funding, Shakespeare Globe Centre New Zealand, said,
I asked for 110,000 because I wanted succession planning. I want proper EA so I don't have to work the insane number of 65 hours a week that I do at the moment or more. And so to share that workload with part of the whole application as well. So the 31,000 that we had last 3 years was only a part of the whole amount needed.
To be clear, this is a fair enough thing for Dawn to want. And we should say, her work is highly respected by many in the theatre community in Aotearoa. But this funding was not specifically to put on the Sheila Wynne Festival. Yet many, including many media organisations, as we just heard, were happy to overlook that. Why? Well, it might have something to do with the reasoning given by Creative New Zealand for turning down the funding application.
In releasing that decision, Creative New Zealand has said things like Shakespeare basically is a canon of imperialistic work that doesn't reflect New Zealand well, blah, blah, blah. Blah, blah, blah.
Creative New Zealand ruled the bar as, quote, located within a canon of imperialism and simply isn't relevant for decolonising Aotearoa.
When you apply to Creative NZ for funding, you have to submit, an application. CNZ then contracts external assessors, experts, who assess those applications and they provide guidance and recommendations to Creative NZ. Following a panel discussion about the merits of the different applications, CNZ then makes a call on what projects receive what funding. When the Shakespeare Globe Centre's application was denied, a handful of quotes from one assessor justifying that decision to cut the funding made their way into the media.
These comments have definitely been cherry-picked as far as I can tell from the longer reports that the assessors of the Shakespeare Globe Centre New Zealand's funding application would have written. That's worth bearing in mind. We don't know the full context in which they were made. So these peer assessors, the quotations that have been picked out and kind of thrown around in the media, that Shakespeare Globe Centre New Zealand's application, and it's worth bearing in mind again that this is the application that's being assessed. It's not kind of the sum total of the work that they've done over the past 30 years. It's how they've represented the effects and the benefits of that work in the application that they've made. So it did not demonstrate the relevance to the contemporary art context of Aotearoa in this time and place and landscape, and went on to say that Shakespeare is located within a canon of imperialism, and the Shakespeare Globe Centre New Zealand misses the opportunity to create a living curriculum and show relevance. And they further questioned whether Shakespeare Globe Centre New Zealand is most relevant for a decolonising Aotearoa in the 2020s and beyond. And so I think there are some interesting things within those comments that have contributed to what people have had their noses put out of joint by.
What on earth are you doing? What on earth are you doing seeking advice on a project like this from someone who is so delusional as to look at Shakespeare in a context of colonialism?
I feel like that's the whole point of why we perform Shakespeare, to modernise it and customise our performance to fit our own themes and ideas into them, not these ones of colonial and imperialistic demeanour.
The thing that interests me, actually, we'll come to the canon of imperialism and the decolonisation in a minute, but the thing that interests me the most is this insistence on relevance. I think we've bought into this cult of relevance across a variety of different arenas. Certainly, university and high school curriculums are often choosing texts based on their relevance. The question is always relevant to whom, and who decides what is relevant. And the question that doesn't get asked often is, well, does something have to be relevant to be important? Is relevance the same as importance? Something might not be relevant to us here in Aotearoa in 2022, but it could still be really important. And so that's kind of one thing, that insistence on relevance within those quotations that were picked out. But then I think the thing that has stoked some somewhat unsightly fires, these references to Shakespeare being located within a canon of imperialism and also not being relevant to a decolonising Aotearoa. I mean, Shakespeare certainly has been, I'm a Shakespeare scholar. I actually work on the history of how people have received Shakespeare over the past 4 centuries, and that reception history is really interesting. I mean, this idea of Shakespeare as the Bard of Avon, England's national poet, things like, that wasn't something that existed in Shakespeare's lifetime, for instance. It was posthumously constructed in a variety of ways, some of which we might consider to be sort of insidious, and some of which do kind of intersect with the colonial project a bit later on. So certainly in the past, I think that idea that Shakespeare is located within a canon of imperialism actually isn't that far from the mark, but I would question to what extent that holds true today. I would say that actually Shakespeare's sort of broken free from his kind of colonial tethers and has just become this global brand. Shakespeare is being performed across the world every day in countries that were former colonisers, were formerly colonised, had nothing to do with a colonial project, being performed in a variety of different languages by a variety of different cultures. I wondered whether some of the people who got a bit anxious about the use of this language and the idea of cancelling Shakespeare were actually worried about us here in Aotearoa no longer being part of that global performance tradition, rather than kind of thinking about those direct sort of colonial links between England and Aotearoa. And then, to come to that idea of decolonisation, I think this is a word and a term that people still feel kind of uncomfortable about. They don't quite know what it means in practice. I'm not sure that when it comes to the arts industry that we've really had a sort of wide-ranging collective discussion about what it means and what it could mean in terms of Creative New Zealand's remit to fund art made here. I think if you were to kind of step back and think broadly about their remit, you might say, well, yes, I think this is in keeping with a decolonising project, but actually that term and its cognates don't appear anywhere within the organisation's kind of vision and values documents available on their website. So I think there's a lack of understanding, or just even a lack of consensus about what that term means and whether there is a space for Shakespeare within a decolonising Aotearoa or not. And I think that possibly people didn't agree with the assessors kind of offering an opinion about that.